The federal deficit does not matter. Video number 3. This is a revised version. P.O.F.O.S.I.E. First, let's cover the preliminaries. For this series of videos, the main thrust of the message has not changed, and it is that the federal deficit is irrelevant. On my whiteboard, you will see that the upper portion is exactly the same for the previous 2 videos, except for the number designation, which indicates that this is video number 3. And also for the record on this video, allow me to point out the fact that former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney are both on the public record as stating, and I quote, "The deficit does not matter," end quote. Also allow me to point out the fact that former President Obama and now President Trump, by their fiscal policies, which have in the past and are now being presided over, have and are respectively stating that the federal deficit is irrelevant, though not stating same verbally. By the way, my name is Oscar Dean Wyndham, and I have written the quintessential book on the subject of our irrelevant deficit, explaining in depth the how and whys, which of course explains that we don't actually have a national debt, and it is titled Revised Second Edition, All About Equity Spending with a Love Story. In closing for video number 2, it was indicated that on this third video, the monetizing subject will be examined, and when monetizing is discussed, one really can't escape including quantitative easing, which is basically the same, whereas monetizing seems to be more about the farce of loaning ourselves money with the use of our federal securities, or more precisely, federal bonds, while quantitative easing, as in easing our federal financial stress, is more about just electronically generating the monies, which is the whole exercise in a nutshell for both monetizing and quantitative easing, which, as you can see, is spelled out on the lower portion of my whiteboard. This way of meeting federal expenditures will never stop nor decrease, but instead will only increase exponentially in the coming years, and is probably another reason why former President George W. Bush went on the public record and stated, and again I quote, "The deficit does not matter," end quote. If you will recall, former President George W. Bush never vetoed a single spending bill while in office, which resulted in the deficit ballooning up into the trillions and him being criticized and given the blame, which I believe will be turned around in the near future to him being given the credit for deliberately forcing the issue of the deficit being irrelevant onto the national scene. I go into a little more detail on this subject in my book, and in so doing, former President George W. Bush is recognized as being a visionary who has seen the future and has taken an appropriate measure to help fulfill our destiny, with the majority of we the people being dragged along, kicking and screaming, all the way into a potentially heretofore unknown, prosperous, and fulfilling future, if, and it's a really big if, our federal employees take the appropriate measures to guard against inflation, which was addressed in video number 1, and if they also take the appropriate measures to prevent the expected abuse, usually associated with having virtually unlimited financial resources. Again, I go into much more detail in my book, where the talking points for this perspective are established in the fictional novel and then expounded upon in the non-fictional continuing commentary section between chapters 19 and 20. As for monetizing and its kissing cousin, quantitative easing, let's take a look at how it is done using our federal bonds program, and of note, it's real easy to find the substantiation for this discussion online. Once again, what our federal employees do when there are insufficient funds available in the Treasury is that they sell bonds to ourselves using one of the 4 different types of bonds, and for this discussion, we'll use a 20-year bond plan. This is where the quantitative easing farce comes in, and in a way it's not really a farce, but you be the judge. In order to sell ourselves these bonds over this 20-year plan, we electronically generate the monies, and then our federal employees take the monies, which was just electronically generated, and now it is officially federal government proceeds, and our federal employees use these monies to meet federal expenditures. And keep in mind, we the people's federal government can't enter into any type of money-making venture that can produce a profit. So now we have our federal expenditures met, and everything is hunky-dory, but darn, The next year rolls around and the same problem arises. We don't have enough money from our federal income tax program and the royalties from federal land lease and federal timber sales and federal oil lease and whatever other federal income programs there may be. So what is the body to do? No problem. We simply sell ourselves more bonds, and then our federal employees use that monies to not only meet the current new federal expenditures, but they also pay ourselves the interest due on all the previous bond programs. And if there are bonds that have reached maturity and must be retired, then we have the monies for that as well. And if not, we sell ourselves more bonds and convert the fictitious debt from one side of the ledger onto the now real asset column on the other side of the ledger. As President Trump puts it, easy. This is how we are meeting our federal expenditures, and you might want to compare the private sector bond sale guidelines with our federal government bond sales to ourselves guidelines. To say we the people are abusing the power of our federal government is a gross understatement as far as taking advantage of the private sector. This is to say that we should turn over all bond sales to the private sector. Sure, our federal government still regulates and guarantees where and when appropriate, but we really shouldn't be in the banking business, in my opinion. Read my book, the revised second edition, titled All About Equity Spending with a Love Story, for a greater panorama of the entire matter, but for this presentation it must be stated. We don't have any moral right to abuse our system this way and to insult the intelligence of we the American people like this. Sure, we will never stop electronically generating the monies needed in order to meet federal expenditures, nor should we, and this type of federal expenditures payment will definitely increase exponentially in the coming years, but the question now has to be asked. Why not just skip all the meaningless bond sales to ourselves and all the other related measures and just tell we the people the truth for a change? We're adults for the most part, and we can handle the truth, and again, for the most part. So far, this has been a somewhat condensed version of our monetizing and quantitative easing program, relying on you to read my book for a more in-depth view. But for now, let's ask the big question that a lot of people just don't want to ask. But here we are in the privacy of your online viewing, and you don't have to tell anyone that you dared to extrapolate this far into our inevitable future. The question that you are probably asking is, since we have in the past, we are now, and we will in the future, electronically generate the monies needed to meet federal expenditures when there are insufficient funds from our federal income tax program, why not do away with our federal income tax altogether and pay all of our federal expenditures with electronically generated monies? The answer is that we eventually will, and I believe this is what former President George W. Bush envisioned many years ago. But before we can speak to the answer, we must first ask the question in a public format, and this relates to the essence of my book. This is the reasoning followed. If the federal deficit is irrelevant, and it has now been proven that the deficit is indeed irrelevant, then we don't need a federal income tax, which is in line with Euclid's axiom or common notion, which states things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. This, of course, means that since the deficit does not matter, then there is no need for a federal income tax, and this truth should now have been driven home by the extraordinary economic measures being exercised in order to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic. But it is the final step that really rattles a lot, if not most people. Follow me on this. Since the deficit is irrelevant and we don't need a federal tax of any kind, then according to Euclid, we are saying that there will be no monies going into the Treasury, only monies going out. This is where people get stuck, but this is where we are going, and it can't be stopped. This concludes video number 3. Please read my book, the revised second edition, titled All About Equity Spending with a Love Story, and when you do, you will probably read it a second time, if not more. And then you should contact your senators and congressional representatives and just ask them if they do or do not understand that the federal deficit is irrelevant. Video number 3 transcript is available on my Facebook page, P.O.O.F.O.S.I.E.